long before a body could lift a bright, clear bottle of honey off a grocery shelf, cheap and pretty and clear as glass by the case and good for any table, and never once wonder whether what was inside it had ever come within a mile of a bee. There was the keeping of the bees by hand, the slow and patient work of a whole summer of bloom, and the taking of the honey only when the bees themselves had ripened it and sealed it and said that it was done. Before the honey of a whole county came poured bright and clear out of a glass bottle filled on a machine and set on every table from 1,000 identical jars, there was a woman on a farm in the hills of eastern Ohio who took her honey the way the old people had always taken it. Out of nothing but her own hives and her own gentle hand and a little smoke and a knife and a length of clean muslin cloth. It began with the bees working the bloom of a long summer, and ended when the comb was capped and ripe, and not 1 hour before, with a honey so pure and so whole and so alive that it kept sound and sweet for years in a stone crock, and was nothing on this earth but the cured flower nectar the bees had sealed, with the living pollen and the fine wax still in it, exactly and only what it said it was. The goodness did not come out of a bottle. It came up out of the bloom of the fields and the patient work of the hives and the gentling hand of one woman who would not take a drop of it before the bees had finished it. And it had in it the whole honest life of the flowers and the bees and an unhurried craft. Never the honey a plant turned out by the 1,000, the same bright clear bottle 10,000 times over, bought cheap in bulk by the barrel and heated hard till every living thing in it was dead, filtered dead and clear to a pretty amber, and stretched heavy with a cheap clear syrup that was never honey at all and never declared on the label. Never the cheap clear honey a body bought only because it was a pretty bright clear bottle for a quarter what her crock cost, filtered so dead and stretched so heavy that no soul outside the plant could have said how much of what was in that clear, bright bottle had ever passed through a bee. Never the honey a body bought because it was cheap and clear and everyone bought it, and the county grocer called the old comb honey cloudy and crude and slow. The old way asked a harder patience and made a different promise, and the woman who still took her honey that old slow way by her own bees and her own hand and her own muslin cloth in the warm long autumn of 1973 was a widow named Mary Troyer of the church district out past the old crossroads the plain people of Holmes County, Ohio, had long called Cherry Hill, where a long row of white wooden hives her husband had built with his own hands still held a whole craft the county had decided was a cloudy and useless relic. Mary Troyer was 62 years old that autumn. She worked a farm at the end of a long lane in the green folded hills of Holmes County, Ohio, and she was the last woman in her district who still took all her honey entirely the old way, from her own hives, capped and ripe and cut by hand, and strained cold or left whole in the comb, never heated and never stretched and never strained dead, and the modern townsfolk had taken to saying of her, when they were sure she could not hear, that the old widow out the Cherry Hill Road was still cutting honey out of the comb with a knife and letting it drip through a rag like it was her grandmother's day, when a body could buy a bright clear bottle cheaper and prettier at the new plant. They did not mean it kindly. Her husband Eli had taught her the bees across the long years of their marriage, and Eli had passed on in the autumn of 1967, 6 years gone now, and in those 6 years Mary had kept every old way the two of them had kept together, not out of grief and not out of stubbornness, though the county said both freely, but because the old way was honest, and she knew it was honest the way she knew ripe honey from green with her eyes shut. By the weight of the capped comb in her hand, and a thick, slow draw of it off a spoon, and a deep, sweet flower of it on her tongue. She rose before light. She lit the lamp and went out across the dark dooryard and saw to the stock in the cool, and then, in the honey season of the warm autumn, she walked out to the hive row and the little honey house at the edge of the orchard before she did another thing, the way another woman might step first into a quiet church, and stood a moment in the cool morning that smelled of clover and beeswax and the warm, sweet breath of the hives. She knew every hive of that long row by the work of her hand and Eli's that had built it. The white wooden hive bodies his own hands had cut and joined the first summer they kept bees, set in a clean row along the south edge of the orchard out of the wind. The little honey house, the extracting bench, the muslin straining cloth, the rows of clean stone crocks along the cool shelf, and resting on the bench beside the smoker, the small leather bee bellows, the little hand-stitched bellows Eli had made and worked with his own careful hand the first summer they kept bees, the leather gone dark and supple, and the wooden cheeks worn smooth and honey-dark with the working of 1,000 mornings and with that one bellows. Every single year, the first hive of the season was quieted before a calm was ever lifted. Not one thing in that honey house had ever come out of a factory, and nothing in it had ever once been heated dead or stretched with a drop of syrup. A man named Glenn Wirtz did not believe in the comb. He ran the new county honey packing plant on the edge of the county seat, 50 years old. A brisk, hearty man in a checked sport coat and a narrow tie, with a quick smile and a quicker head for what a thing cost to buy and what it brought, who believed in the modern grocery trade down to the soles of his shoes. He believed, with his whole training behind the belief, that the new packing line had finally made honey cheap and bright and clear and steady, the same in every bottle, and that a woman still smoking her own hives and cutting honey out of the comb with a knife and letting it drip through a rag into a crock was a sweet relic who had not yet done the arithmetic. He had come out Mary's Lane twice that year, the first time to ask whether she would sell him her crop in bulk to run through his line, and the second in the bright warm of September. With a clear bottle of his plant honey held out before him and a look Mary had seen on a certain kind of man her whole life long. "Mrs. Troyer," he had said. Holding the clear bottle up to the light the way a man holds up a thing he is proud to be selling, "I'll be plain with you, because it's good business to be. We run honey through the line at the plant by the barrel, where you wait all summer on the bees, and it's heated and filtered and bottled bright and clear and on the truck by the case, and I sell it to the new county home and the school and every young family for less than a quarter what one of your crocks would cost me, and they cannot get enough of it. It's clear as glass, and it never sets up cloudy or grainy in the jar, and it's the same in every bottle every time. I don't say it to be unkind, but the grocer in town himself will tell you that cloudy comb honey of yours, with the wax and the bit still floating in it, strained through a rag and sold out of an old stone crock, is exactly the kind of slow crude thing the new way was made to do away with. The kind thing, the modern thing, is to let those old hives go, and let me sell you a clean, bright, clear bottle any week of the year for what it cost you to wait out a whole summer of bees. Mary had not argued with him, for she did not argue with men who had already decided. She stood with one hand flat on the warm wood of the nearest hive and let Glenn Wirtz say all of it, and when the man had run out of words, she said only this: "It is clear, Mr. Wirtz, I will grant you that, and it is cheap, and it is steady. The question is not how clear a honey looks in the glass, nor how cheap, nor even how steady. A honey can be clear and dead and still and be no honey at all, and that is a thing your trade has forgotten. The question is what is truly in the bottle, and whether the man who filled it could tell you to the spoonful what passed through a bee and what came out of a barrel of cheap syrup, and whether it is the one whole thing it says it is. You have made a honey clear and cheap and steady. You have not yet made me one I would set on the table of a family I loved without asking what your line had filtered out of it and what it had poured in. Glenn Wirtz had not the faintest idea what she meant, and he had smiled the way a man smiles at a thing he has given up trying to sell, and left a bright plant, circular, on the hive lid, and driven back down the long lane shaking his head at the stubbornness of the old widow who would not be brought along into the present age. This is the place to say plainly what this channel is, here near the start, because all the rest of this story belongs to the kind of person who will already understand it without being told twice. This is a place for the ones who have watched somebody quiet and unfashionable get written off by every person who was supposed to know better, and who held to a small and private and stubborn faith that the patient one and the careful work would be proven right in the long end of things. If that is the kind of story that steadies something down deep in a person, then this is the channel that tells it one week after another, and the ones who stay are exactly the ones it was built for. So this is the moment to subscribe and then to stay all the way to the end of this one, because the end is the part most worth the keeping. There were others who agreed with Glenn Wirtz, and they were not all strangers to her kind. There was Howard Lentz, the grocer who ran the bright new market on the county seat square, a trim and certain man of 48 in a clean apron and a bow tie, who stocked his shelves with the modern age and prided himself on it, and who carried a genuine belief that he was doing right by his customers in giving them a clear, bright, steady bottle instead of a cloudy crock that set up grainy by. Christmas. He had nothing personal against Mary Troyer. He had shelves to fill and a margin to keep, and a circular from the plant that swore the bright bottled honey was cleaner and clearer and cheaper than any comb honey on earth, and an old woman still cutting honey out of a frame and selling it cloudy out of a crock was by every line of his thinking. Exactly the kind of slow backward thing a modern grocer was bound to clear off his shelf and be glad of it. Howard Lentz said as much to her face the one time she brought a few crocks of her comb honey into town to sell. He met her at the counter with a certain step and his modern eye, not cruel, only certain, and he looked over the heavy stone crocks and the whole white comb floating in the thick pale honey, and told her, kindly enough, that cloudy comb honey with the wax and the bits still in it looked unclean to a modern shopper next to a clear, bright bottle. That he had given his whole honey shelf over to the plant's bottles and would never go back, and that it was a wonder to him anybody bought such a cloudy, grainy thing at all when the plant's honey was clear as glass and cost half as much. Mary Troyer did not argue the half of it, for she was not a woman who argued with a person holding a circular she had not written. She let him finish and let him judge, and then she drew up a slow, thick spoonful of the pale gold comb honey, the wax and the pollen and all, and held it out, and said, "Taste it, Mr. Lentz, and tell me what is wrong with it." Howard Lentz, a thorough man, did taste it, and it was thick and deep and many-flowered on the tongue. The whole long summer of clover and basswood and wild aster in it at once sweeter and rounder and more alive than any clear, bright bottle he had sold in a year. He stood a moment plainly confused by the gap between his circular and the honey, and then he set the spoon down over the gap the way a certain kind of person will, and said that good or not it was cloudy and slow and would never look right on a modern shelf, and went back to his store certain he had done right by it. And there was Roy Hostetler, raised plain down the road and gone across to a progressive church that allowed the car and the electric line, who had no patience left for the old ways he had been at such pains to leave behind. He bought his family's honey from Glenn Wirtz's plant the year it opened by the case, and was proud to say it, and he was not content to leave old Mary Troyer to her bees in peace. He stood at the feed mill that autumn and announced, loud enough to carry to the scale house, that his old neighbor out the Cherry Hill Road was still cutting honey out of the comb with a knife like it was 1890, and that it was no wonder at all, a widow alone on a farm with nobody left to tell her the world had gone and learned to buy a clear, bright bottle of honey off a shelf, without ever waiting on a hive. The men at the mill had laughed, some of them, and some had only studied their boots, but no one had spoken up against it. Roy Hostetler was not content to leave it at the feed mill either. He came out Mary's Lane himself in the bright warm of September, on a Saturday when he knew the road would have eyes on it, and brought his grown son and a tone a certain kind of man saves for the women he means to set straight whether they will it or not. He stood at the hive row with his thumbs in his belt and told Mary that the world had changed, and there was no shame in changing with it, that she was an old woman wearing herself out over a thing the rest of the world had had the sense to lay down, and that he would haul a half-dozen cases of the plant's good bright bottled honey up himself if she would only quit the foolishness. His son stood looking at the long row of white hives and said something low, and the two of them laughed, not cruelly, but the way men laugh at a thing they are certain of. Mary Troyer did not answer the half of it. She took up a heavy stone crock of comb honey from the bench, honey her own bees had cured and capped that very summer, and set it in Roy Hostetler's arms and said, "This came off this farm, Roy, off the bloom of fields that lie the same as your father's fields, gathered by my own bees and cut by my own hand, and not one drop of anything in it but what a bee made. And there is not one thing in it I could not name to you. Take it home and set it on your table a season before you tell me to quit." Roy Hostetler hefted the crock once, and a thing moved behind his eyes that might have been a memory of his own mother's honey house and a warm, sweet smell of cut comb, and then he set it down on the hive lid and said, "Well, suit yourself, Mary," in a harder voice than he had come with, and drove down the lane, and the crock stood where he had left it until she carried it back to the cool shelf. So the county agreed, in the easy and unconsidered way that a county agrees about a thing it never has to think very hard about, that the old widow out the Cherry Hill Road was a sweet and stubborn relic keeping a cloudy old craft alive past its time, harmless and a little pitiable, behind the times the way the whole plain settlement was, only more so and more alone. These were respected people, Glenn Wirtz and Howard Lentz and Roy Hostetler, with standing and reasons and the whole confident weight of the modern world behind them, and approving of how wrong they were would cost the county dearly before the autumn was out. If you've made it this far into Mary's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is the thing that Glenn Wirtz with all his sharp arithmetic could not see, and that Howard Lentz with all his modern circular could not weigh. The honesty of Mary's honey was not a thing added on at the end or claimed on a label. It was the whole slow craft itself, every step of it bent toward one end, which was to take nothing the bees had not made and to put nothing into the crock that a flower had not given, and to take even that only when the bees themselves had ripened and sealed it and said that it was done. The old people had taken honey that way for as long as there had been bees and boxes and knives to cut the comb, and they had learned across all those years, by patient watching, exactly what a honey is and what it is not. And they had bred that knowing into the craft itself until a woman who learned it right could not have sold a false or a fouled honey if she tried. For the first care of all was the ripeness and the patience, and there the old way and the plant way parted before a drop was ever taken. Mary took her honey only when the bees had capped the comb over with wax, every cell sealed, for the capping was the bee's own word that the nectar had cured down thick and ripe and would keep. And a honey taken green and uncapped is too thin and too wet, and will sour and ferment in the crock, and she would no more take an uncapped comb than a careful woman would pull green corn. And then she handled what she took as gently and as little as a thing can be handled, cutting the whole capped comb out clean, or crushing the cut comb soft and letting the honey drip cold and slow of its own weight through a length of clean muslin into the crock, never pressing it hard and never heating it at all, so that it came into the crock thick and alive and whole. The fine wax and the living pollen and the faint, deep flavor of every flower still in it, the honey exactly as the bees had made it, and not one thing more or less. The plant, for its part, did the opposite at every turn. It bought its honey cheap and bulk by the barrel from wherever it came cheapest, and heated it hard, far hotter than a hive ever grows, to make it run thin and bottle fast and kill the least live thing in it, and filtered it dead and bright through fine pads till every trace of pollen and wax was stripped out and it ran clear as water, and then, because clear, cheap honey was still dearer than cheap clear syrup, stretched the dead honey heavy with a cheap glucose corn syrup that was no honey at all, and never said so on the label. The more syrup it poured in, the more bottles it filled, and the cheaper it sold, and not a soul on the line ever once stopped to think what a heated, dead, stretched, barrel-bought honey, shipped green and sold to the whole county as pure, would quietly do the day a single bad barrel went wrong. And there was the keeping and the soundness, the part the modern people trusted least. Mary knew that a true ripe honey, capped by the bees and never heated and never stretched, is one of the soundest foods on earth, that it keeps for years in a crock and will not spoil because it is too thick and too ripe for spoiling to take hold in it, and that to heat it and stretch it thin with syrup is to undo the very thing that kept it sound and opened the door to every spoiling the whole. Honey had been proof against. The plant did not understand the soundness it was destroying. It saw only that heat made the honey run and bottle fast, and syrup made it cheap, and it trusted the clear, bright look of the jar to stand for a purity it had stripped clean out, the stretched honey looking finer in the glass the very moment it had been made less sound and less true than the cloudy crock it was sold to replace. The whole hard difference was that the old way could not put a false or a spoiled thing in the crock if a body tried, for the craft was the taking of nothing but ripe sealed honey and the putting in of nothing at all, while the fast cheap way leaned its whole selling on a clear bright look it bought by heating the life dead and stretching the honey with syrup, and sold the look of purity as the thing itself, where no one could taste the difference until a bad barrel made it plain. Mary Troyer knew the danger of a heated barrel, bought honey the way she knew the back of her own hand. For Eli had taught her that a honey is only as clean as the least clean thing that went into the barrel it came out of, and that the heat and the syrup that made it look bright were the very things that let a foul barrel pass for sound. She had heard, that autumn, that the new plant bought its honey cheap and bulk by the barrel from far off, and the hearing of it had sat cold in her stomach, for she knew that a sickness that comes wrapped in a clear, bright bottle that looks cleaner than anything on the shelf is a cruel sickness, because no one lays it to the honey until the harm is already spreading through every kitchen in the county at once. To understand why Mary would not be moved, a body has to go back to the first honey season of her marriage, to the summer of 1936, when she was a young wife of 25, learning the bees at her husband's side at that same hive row. Eli Troyer had kept bees the way his father and his grandfather had kept them before him, and across that first season he taught her it all. The gentling of the hive with a little smoke, the reading of the capped comb for ripeness, the cutting of the comb and the cold, slow straining through muslin, and the keeping of the sound, whole honey in clean crocks. He had built the white hives himself and stitched the little leather bellows to his hand that first summer, and he had quieted the first hive of their life together with his own hands and showed her how it was always to be done. The first hive of the year gentled soft before a comb was ever lifted. A honey is made or lost in the patience and the leaving alone, he had told her. Take only what the bees have sealed and put nothing into it and never heat it, and it will feed a family suite a year and keep sound for years, and never once be anything but what it is. And he had told her the thing she had held to ever since, that a true honey taken by hand was not only the finest sweet a household could keep, but the safest. Because a craft a body could watch and taste and keep whole at every step could carry no hidden foulness the way a far barrel and a heated bright bottle could. The young wife had thought, that first summer, with a young woman's impatience on her, that the bees were a great deal of slow, careful, waiting over a thing a body could nearly buy already bottled in the towns. And she had been young enough to say so out loud. And Eli, who never wasted many words, had set down the smoker and said, "Then the year will come, Mary, when the quick, cheap, bright honey sickens the tables of a whole county at once in a way no eye thinks to lay to a clear, bright bottle the way the slow, whole way never can. And on that day, the only honey a body can set before a sick family will be the comb taken ripe and kept whole by a hand that put nothing into it, and I would have it be ours." She had not understood it then. She kept the bees at his side for 30 years, and somewhere in those years the understanding came to her, and she did not let go of it for the rest of her life. The leather bee bellows was the oldest tool of the craft that was wholly her own, and the dearest, because Eli's hands had cut and stitched it and quieted the first hive of their life together with it, and every first hive of every season for 30 years had been gentled under it. And when Eli died in that autumn of 1967, with the season's last honey already in the crocks and the hives put down for the winter, Mary had gone out to the hive row the morning after the funeral, alone, and laid her hand on the dark supple leather of the bellows, and stood a long while looking at it. And then she had worked a little smoke from it at the first hive, as he had taught her, and listened to the bees go quiet under her hand, and had not let the hive row go untended a single season since. On the hardest mornings of that hard autumn, when the talk of the whole county seemed to press in at the honey house door, she would take up the little bellows and lay her hand around the worn honey dark wood of the cheeks, smoothed by 30 years of her hand and his. And she would hold it the way another might hold a photograph of the dead. To understand how a honey of that kind was truly taken, a body has to follow it through the whole season of it, because the taking was never the one quick afternoon the county imagined. It was the patient work of a whole summer of bloom, and it began long before the first comb was ever cut. Mary tended her bees gentle all through the spring and summer, the long bloom of dandelion and clover and basswood and the wild aster of the fall, asking nothing of them but that they work the bloom and cure the comb in their own time, and she worked the hives only on the warm still days and only with a little cool smoke from the bellows. For she knew that bees worked rough make a poor cross hive and a poorer honey, and a gentle hand was paid back in the comb. And she watched across the season, never crowding the bees nor starving them, leaving them always honey enough for their own winter, taking only the true surplus the strong hives made over their own keeping. Then came the taking and the straining, the slow patient heart of the whole craft. She took the honey only when the bees had capped the comb over white and sealed, lifting the heavy ripe frames in the warm of the day, and she brushed the bees gently back to the hive and took not a single bee with the comb. Then, in the cool of the honey house, she cut the whole capped comb out clean for the comb honey she sold in the crock entire. Or for the strained honey she sliced the wax cappings thin off the comb and set the cut comb to drip, and let the honey run cold and slow of its own weight through a length of clean muslin into the crock, never warming it past the warmth of the day and never pressing it hard, for a honey heated or pressed is a honey bruised. And a honey left to drip cold and slow comes into the crock hole and alive with all its flowers and its pollen still in it. She let it settle a day or two in the cool until the last fine flecks of wax rose soft to the top, and skimmed those clean, and that was all. Then, on the cool dark shelf of the honey house and the cellar, came the long keeping, the part the county thought was no part at all. She filled her clean stone crocks with the cold whole honey and covered them and set them by, and there the honey kept, month upon month and year upon year, sound and sweet and whole, for the keeping was no idle storing, but the very proof of the thing, that a true ripe honey, kept whole and unheated, will hold sound for years and need nothing done to it. Will candy soft and pale and grainy in the cool the way all true honey will, and be only the sweeter and the more surely real for it, the very graining the modern shopper had been taught to fear being the plainest sign that the honey in the crock was the whole living thing, and not a heated, dead syrup-stretched bottle that would stay false clear forever, because there was too little true honey left in it to candy at all. That was all the craft, begun in the bloom of the spring and the gentling of the bees, and finished in the long sound keeping of the crock, and it could not be hurried and could not be faked, and at the end of it stood rows of heavy crocks of pale gold honey that had a whole summer of bloom and a whole craft of patience kept whole in them. And they would feed a family suite for years, and keep sound on any shelf in any season, and never once be anything on this earth but exactly and only what they said they were. Down in the county seat, the modern trade did as it always did, which was to say the plant bought its honey cheap and bulk by the barrel, and heated it and filtered it and stretched it, and Glen Wirtz sold it bright and clear by the case to every store, and the new county home and the school across the county, and hardly a buyer ever asked the one question that mattered, which was what was truly in the clear, bright bottle and where the honey in the barrel had come from. The county filled its pantries and its kitchens with the bright, cheap bottles season after season and never gave a worried thought to any of it, because it was clear as glass and it stayed clear and the price was right. Roy Hostetler bought it for his family by the case and stood at the mill and called the old widow's hives a cloudy waste of a good woman's years, and most of the county quietly agreed with him. The harm came on quiet that time, and that was the worst of it, for a thing that looks cleaner than anything else on the shelf is a thing no one thinks to lay at the door of the table. It did not strike a county all at once the way a plain spoiled thing does. It crept in over a warm, long autumn, kitchen by kitchen, wherever the bright, clear bottles from one bad run had gone. It began as a scattering of households down with a hard gut sickness, a deep, griping illness that put grown men and women flat for days, and at first no one tied the cases together, for they were scattered across 5 townships and looked like nothing but the ordinary sickness that goes round a county in the turn of the season. But the cases did not pass off ordinary, and they fell when at last a careful eye gathered them on exactly and only the households that had set the plant's bright bottled honey on their tables, and hardest on the kitchens that used the most of it. The big families and the boarding tables and the county home, while not one household that kept the old widow's crock honey or no honey at all took the least harm. By the deep of that autumn, the doctors of the county seat were uneasy and baffled. The same hard, griping sickness in too many houses at once, and no clear cause, until some doctor with a cool head and a long memory asked the one kind of question that breaks such a thing open, which was not what these households had caught, but what every sick table had set before them that the well tables had not. And the slow, plain answer that came back was the new, bright bottled honey, the clear, cheap jar from one bad run, on every sick table and on none of the well ones. He had the bottles gathered and held, and the lot numbers traced back to the plant, and the plain, frightening shape of it came clear, that the sickness had ridden into the county in the one thing on the table that looked the cleanest of all. It was a long and frightening reckoning, slower than a plain poisoning, but no less cruel for the slowness. And as the word spread, the whole county turned to it, the doctors and at last the state and the families with the bright bottles in the pantry were told to put the honey away until the thing was run to ground, and the buggies went out along the plain roads to the houses with no telephone to carry the word. And the doctors, once they had the shape of it, worked hard and long over the worst of the sickened, and brought nearly all of them through in time with care and rest in the grace of God. But it was the nearest and the saddest thing, for a foulness carried hidden in a food is a deep harm, and a few of the worst sickened, the oldest and the frailest grown folk, were a long, long while mending, and the county came that hard autumn within a hair of burying a good many of its own off a bright, clear bottle it had trusted on every table. And it was, every bit of it, the cheap, bright honey the whole county had trusted, bought cheap and bulk by the barrel, heated dead and filtered bright and stretched heavy with an undeclared syrup and fouled in a bad barrel and sold as pure. The very thing the grocer's own circular had blessed and the old woman's crocks damned. No eye had caught it and no tongue had weighed it, because the one thing the fast, bright way had built its whole selling on was exactly the clear, bright look that the heating and the filtering and the stretching gave it, and a clear, bright bottle gives nothing away. And yet not every table in the county had set out the plant's bright bottled honey that autumn, and that was the thing that would not be explained away after, the thing that turned a slow sickness into a reckoning. Here and there across the county were the households that had not bought the cheap bright bottle at all, the old plain families and a few stubborn English ones who still kept their own bees or bought the heavy crocks off a hive row out the Cherry Hill Road, and at those tables that whole hard autumn the honey was the same as it had always been, ripe and whole and sound. And not one soul at those tables took the least harm. While the doctors filled their books with the griped and the slow mending, there stood scattered through the same county a dozen quiet pantries where the old crock honey had sweetened a family's table all season long and had done only the one plain thing it was made to do, which was to feed them sweet and keep sound, and be nothing but exactly what it said it was. The state men came down hard that same autumn, the way they come when a county slowly finds it has been sickening its own off a shelf, and they ordered every bottle and every case of the plant's honey off every shelf in the state at once, a full recall. The trucks sent back out to gather in what they had carried out, the bright cases hauled down off the store shelves and out of the county home pantry by the hundred and held under seal. And the man who walked the bright clean aisle of his market with the gravest face of all was Howard Lentz, the same grocer who a month before had called the old crock honey cloudy and crude. For it was his own shelves the bright honey had gone out from, and his own customers, the families he had been so sure he was serving well, whose people had griped and sickened the worst, and he had cleared the cloudy crocks off his shelf himself to make room for it. The lawsuit was the thing that broke it open all the way, for a family of the county seat whose grown father had been sickened near to death brought a suit against the plant with a county lawyer behind it. And once the suit was filed, the state inquiry had its teeth, and the men went into the plant and onto the line and into the very making of the honey. And there they found every one of the things the old widow had named from the start, a honey bought cheap and bulk from far-off barrels of no certain keeping, heated hard past all its soundness, filtered dead and clear, and stretched heavy with a cheap glucose corn syrup never declared on a single label, and one bad barrel of it carrying a foulness clean through a whole bottling run. And a plant man allowed, when it was put to him plain, that of course they heated it and filtered it and cut it with syrup, for it ran clear and bottled fast and sold cheap, and the customers liked how bright it looked, and no one had ever told him to fear what one bad barrel of far-bought honey, stripped and stretched and bottled bright, could carry hidden into 10,000 kitchens at once. And Howard Lentz stood there in the inquiry with his modern judgment gone still, and understood far too late that the very brightness he had cleared his shelf to stock had been the mask the foulness rode into his customers' kitchens behind. And then, because something in the grocer had not been able to forget that thick, deep, many-flowered honey he had tasted off a spoon a month before, he asked the inquiry to send a man out the long lane to the old widow for a crock of her honey, and had it tested the very same way the bright bottles had been tested, and the honey off Mary Troyer's cool shelf came back exactly as the old people would have promised, pure and whole and unheated and unadulterated, nothing in it but the cured nectar of the fields and the living pollen and the fine wax, no foreign syrup at all, sound and clean to the last spoonful, so wholly and only honey that the man reading the figures checked them twice. For he had not tested a honey so pure and so plainly real in all his years at the work. He tested another crock, because a careful inquiry does not trust a single trial, and it came back the same, and the report was written in the flat language of such men that the illnesses originated wholly within the plant's bottled honey. A heated and over-filtered product stretched with undeclared glucose syrup and contaminated within a bulk source barrel, and that the hand-taken comb honey from the Troya farm was found upon testing to be pure, raw, unadulterated, and sound, well within every limit the laboratory knew. And the thing that struck the county hardest once they sat with it was that the very crocks the grocer had called cloudy and the plant man had called crude had quietly sweetened the county's table sound and whole all through the same hard autumn that the bright clear bottle slowly sickened them. And Howard Lentz, who was an honest man under the certainty, drove out to that farm himself in the gray week after, not to inspect a thing and not to judge, but only to stand before her, for he had a thing to say that a person owes to say to a face. He found Mary Troyer in the honey house, settling the last crocks of the season straining onto the cool shelf, and he stood in the door with his certainty all gone out of him and told her plainly what they had found, that her crock honey had tested pure and whole and sound and free of any foreign thing, and that the honey she had been selling all along was the one honey in the whole county he should never have doubted. And he said the harder thing, that he had cleared her cloudy crocks off his own shelf a month before to make room for the bright bottles out of a circular that had taught him to prize a clear, bright look, and never once to fear what the heating and the filtering and the stretching had stripped out of it and poured into it, and that his own customers, the families he had been so sure he was serving well, had been the worst sickened of all. Mary Troyer heard him out and set the crock on the shelf and did not gloat, for there was no gloating in her, only a great tiredness and a deep sorrow for the harm done to all those tables and all those sickened folk. And she said only the one thing she meant him to carry away. It was never the cloudiness that was the danger, Misty. Lentz, nor the wax in the comb, nor the graining in the crock, nor the waiting on the bees. The danger was always the same danger it has ever been. A thing that is not what it says it is, sold cheap and bright, because the brightness hides what was taken out of it and what was poured in, and your circular had it exactly backward. The slow way puts nothing into the honey but what a bee made, and takes nothing out, and so it can hide nothing. The fast way heats the life out, and filters the truth out, and stretches it with syrup, and bottles it bright, and sells the brightness, and the table pays for it the day a bad barrel rides in behind the clear, clean glass. A honey is not made pure by being clear and cheap and bright to the eye. It is made pure by a hand that puts nothing into it and takes only what the bees have sealed, and answers for it. The vindication, when it came, did not come as a single ringing moment, and Mary would not have known what to do with one if it had. It came instead the way such things come in a place like that district, quietly and in the plain form of people, one after another, driving a lane they had always before driven past. The moment the word got loose that the one honey in the county that had not sickened the tables was the raw crock honey off the old widow's hives. It was in that same hard autumn, in the worst of the frightened weeks, that the last thing happened that finally undid her. And no living soul was there to see it. The man from the county paper had asked whether her husband had left any written account of the bees, and so Mary had taken down the old cedar box where Eli had kept his bee notes and his figures dry, and under the worn papers folded away where she had never thought to look in 6 years, she found a thing she had not known was there. It was a sheet of paper written out in Eli's own careful and deliberate hand, and it was dated the summer before he died, the summer of 1966, and it was not a B note at all. It was a letter written to her and folded and laid away unread among the figures, as though the man had known the wife would have a need of it on some far day that he himself would not live to see. She read it alone in the honey house by the light of the lamp, in the cool quiet that smelled of clover and beeswax, and the last of the season's honey, the white hives standing dim in their row beyond the door, and the crocks ranged along the cool shelf. Eli had written to her, "Mary, if you are reading this then, I am gone on ahead of you. And the packing men and the grocers and the neighbors are surely telling you to let the hives go and buy your honey cheap and clear in a bottle at the plant like a sensible woman. And I know you, and I know that you are tempted. Not for your own ease, you were never tempted by ease, but because you have grown so tired of being called cloudy and crude and backward by people who have never once asked what is truly in their own clear, bright bottle. And a body can carry being called a fool a very long way, longer than anyone would think, and then come to one gray morning alone at the hive row and find of a sudden that she cannot carry it one single step further. So I am writing this down to tell you the thing you already know in your hands, but that you may by then have let yourself forget under the weight of all the scorn. The clear, bright honey is not the truer honey, Mary. It is only the cheaper and the prettier one, and a thing is not made pure by being either. They have it exactly backward, the whole age has, when it believes the new, clear, bright way must be the truer way. Our honey is taken ripe and sealed from the bee's own comb and strained cold and put up whole with nothing added and nothing taken away. And there is no false thing in a crock a body has kept whole the whole road of. The plant honey is bought cheap from far barrels and heated dead and filtered bright and stretched with a syrup that never saw a flower, and sold for the look of a purity it has had stripped out of it. And the day a bad barrel rides in behind that clear, clean glass, it will be on 10,000 tables at once, and sickening the families that trusted it before a soul knows to look. So keep the hives, my Mary, keep the bellows and the muslin and the crocks. Take only what the bees have sealed and put nothing into it and never heat it. And quiet the first hive each year under the old bellows, and do not let them shame you out of the one thing you know is true. And when at last they come up the lane, give them good honey, and teach the young ones the craft, and forgive them. Mary Troyer folded the letter back along its old soft creases, and stood a long while in the honey house with a lamplight on the cool crocks, and her hand laid flat on the rim of the nearest one, the honey that had just been proven faithful before the whole county. Then she set the letter back among the figures where Eli had left it. And on her way to the door, she reached out and took up the little leather bee bellows from the bench as she had every morning of the craft, and the leather was dark and supple under her touch, and the worn wood honey dark and smooth, and she was, for the first time since the autumn of the sickening, not entirely alone. Roy Hostetler came up the lane first of the ones who had mocked her. On foot one evening near dark, when the road would be empty of eyes, and he stood at the honey house door, turning his hat in his hands, and told her at last that he had been wrong, plainly wrong, that he had stood at the mill and called her hives a cloudy waste of a good woman's years, and had bought for his own household the very honey that had slowly sickened half the county, and that his own grown daughter had been one of the folk laid flat that autumn and had been a long while mending, and that he was sorry past saying. And Mary looked at him in the last of the light, not unkindly, for she was not a woman who pays a humble person back in their own old coin, and she said only, "It is forgotten, Roy. The hives never heard you. They only ever did the thing they were made to do, whether anyone believed in it or not." And then, because she was practical to her bones, she told him that if he meant it, he could send his son out that next honey season, and she would teach the young man to read the capped comb and quiet a hive, for she would not be at the bees forever. And Roy Hostetler said he would send the young man, and he was a quieter man going down the lane than he had come up it. It was Glenn Wirtz, though, who finally had to face her with all of it, and this is the part that matters the most, and so it has to be told exactly as it happened, with nothing softened. The packing man, the very man who had told her to her face to let her old hives go and sold the bright clear bottle to the county home by the case, came up her lane in the last gray week of that autumn. He had walked the aisle of the market where the bright bottles had stood, and sat in the lawyer's office where the suit against his plant was laid out plain. And somewhere in those gray weeks he had come to understand, far too late for any comfort in it, that he had been completely and certainly wrong about the one thing his whole living had made him most certain of: the difference between a clear honey and a true one. And he had no bright bottle held out before him this time at all. He found Mary Troyer in the honey house, settling the last crocks of the season straining onto the cool shelf, and he stood in the door in his good checked coat, with his hat in his hands, looking at the heavy crocks and the white comb and the crocks ranged along the cool wall. And Mary looked up at him from the crock in her hands, not unkindly, and she spoke before he could find his words. "You have come about the honey," she said. He said yes. He said the inquiry's tests had found his honey heated dead and stretched with syrup and fouled in the barrel, and hers found pure and whole and sound, with nothing in it but what a bee had made, and that the families had been kept whole as much by the crock honey on the stubborn shelves as by anything his bright plant had ever bottled. And then he said the harder thing, that he had measured a honey all his life by what it cost to buy, and how clear it ran, and how bright it looked in the glass, and never once by what was truly in it, and that he wished now he could call every bottle of it back. And he asked her, plainly, to forgive him. Mary Troyer set down the crock and straightened slowly, one hand at the small of her back, and looked at him a long moment in the lamplight. "It is forgotten, Mr. Wirtz," she said. And then she laid her hand flat on the cool rim of the crock and told him the one thing she meant him to carry away, without a word of reproach in it. "You sold what was cheap and clear and bright, and called it as good as mine, and it looked as good in the glass on the easy days, and you were not lying that you knew of. But cheap and clear and bright is a promise that keeps itself only as long as no one ever asks what is truly in the bottle, and one day a bad barrel always rides in, and then it turns on the tables that trusted it, and on the biggest families and the most used pantries first, where it goes out the most. I take a honey ripened sealed from the bee's own comb and strain it cold and put it up whole, with nothing in it but what a flower gave, and it costs more, and it is never once anything but what it says it is. You sold the clear thing, I take the true one. A body may not always be able to keep her own bees, and that is no sin, but she can at least know what is truly in the honey she sets before her family, and you sold a whole county the one and let it believe it had the other. Glen Wirtz stood there a long time, a humbled man, and Mary told him gently that a man is not too old to learn a thing the day he finally wants to. And from that autumn on the plant, gave over the cheap stretched honey and the hard heating, and bought honest local honey it could trace, and bottled it true, and never again sold the look of a thing for the thing itself. And Glen Wirtz carried her crock honey in the front of his own store and told the plain truth to every soul who came in. They came up the lane all that hard rest of the autumn, the way they had once driven past it. The English who remembered a hive row, and the young families who had only ever known the clear bright bottle, and the plain families of 3 districts, all with the same plain need. That there was a honey out the Cherry Hill Road a body could set before a sick child or a frail old grandfather, and never lie awake fearing it. And to every one of them Mary sold what she had at the same fair price as always, for it would have been the easiest thing in the world to raise the price of the one honey a frightened county could trust, and she would not do it. She turned away cold the sharp men who hoped to buy her whole cellar out and sell it back to the frightened at a ruin, telling one such man that she would not sell a frightened county its own fear. And she gave first to the houses where someone lay sick, and to the tables that fed the most. A man drove out to the farm that autumn from a fine grocery house in the city. A soft-spoken buyer who knew good honey the way few men still did, for the story of the honey that did not sicken had traveled once the papers had it, and he tasted a slow spoonful of her calm honey at her kitchen table and grew very quiet, and then told her plainly that it was the finest honey he had tasted in 30 years in the trade, and that the city would pay near any price she named for every crock she could put up, and in the same season a crock of her honey, entered quietly by a neighbor without her asking, was given the blue ribbon over every honey at the county fair, plant and farm alike. But the fame the city man offered she declined, very gently, and the ribbon she let lie. For she kept the bees for the keeping of her own district and the carrying on of the craft, and not for the trade and not for the showing. She gave the city man 1 crock as a gift, and sent him back down the lane a friend but not a customer, and a neighbor kept the ribbon on a nail in the honey house, where it hangs faded to this day. The hives are still there. That is the thing to hold on to in a story like this one. Here at the close of it, the plant was made to give over its cheap stretched honey and bottle an honest one. The county home pantry was supplied again with a true sweet, and the county went on with its life the way a county does. And a good many who had driven her lane that frightened autumn let the memory of the gray season fade as people let such things fade. But the long row of white wooden hives that Eli Troyer built and set along the south edge of the orchard in the first summers of a marriage still stands at the end of the long lane out the Cherry Hill Road, and the bees are worked gentle in every honey season, and the little leather bee-bellows Eli stitched still rests on the bench dark and supple, and with it every single year. The first hive of the season is quieted before a comb is ever lifted, and the ripe-sealed comb is cut by hand and strained cold and slow into the same clean crocks and kept whole and sound on the same cool shelf, and feeds a family suite for years, and never once on any table of any season is anything on this earth but exactly and only what it says it is. Mary kept the bees herself until her hands could no longer do the hard work of the lifting and the cutting and the long day in the honey house, and then she taught it, all of it, to her daughter Anna Raber and to Anna's daughter Lydia Raber, a young woman who had come up the lane to help at the hives and had stayed because the craft had got into her hands the way it once got into Mary's. Lydia keeps the bees now, working them gentle and taking only the sealed comb and straining it cold and putting it up whole, and lets nothing into the crock but what a bee made and takes nothing out. And on the day of her own first honey season, she reached out and quieted the first hive under Eli's old bellows the way she had been taught. And she has not once had to ask a soul to certify that her honey was true, because the work answers for itself on the easy seasons and the hard one alike. The leather bellows still rests on the bench between the seasons, dark and supple to the hand, the wooden cheeks worn honey dark by the grips of better than half a century. Waiting the way it has waited the long years for the next careful pair of hands and the next bright still honey-taking morning. They had called it backward. They had called the hives a cloudy waste, and the crock honey crude, and the waiting on the bees a fool's loss of a good woman's years. And then the clear, bright bottle the whole county had trusted to sweeten its tables turned slowly to sickness against the families that set it out through a whole hard autumn and nearly cost the county a good many of its own, and was pulled off every shelf in the state, and the only honey that did not sicken the tables that set it out was the raw whole crock honey one old widow had taken slow by her own hand off her late husband's hives, and they learned, one gray season too late, the thing the patient one had quietly known all along. A clear thing keeps its bargain only as long as no one ever asks what is truly inside it. A true thing keeps its bargain on the very day the cheap and the bright is found out, and a body has nothing left to lean on but the honesty that was kept in it. Good work is not a brightness a body buys once at the counter and forgets. It is a thing taken ripe off the comb and strained cold and put up whole by a hand that knows every drop of what is in it and what is not, carried faithful through every easy season against the one hard one that always comes at last to ask of a thing what it was truly made of. So here is the question to carry out of it. If the whole county had called your one quiet certainty a cloudy and backward thing, and the clear, bright way were right there on the shelf for a quart of the money, with every respected person in the county and the grocer himself swearing it was clearer and cleaner and better, would you have let the last hive go cold at last, just to be finally done with all the scorn? Or would you have kept on working the bees, gentle, and taking only the sealed comb and straining it cold and slow and putting it up whole through the bright still mornings, on nothing but the faith that the work of your own hands would keep faith with the people who trusted it, and waited out all the easy autumns for the one bitter season that would prove it?